loindeo, ah, wabidi loindeo, loindeo, ah, wabidi loindeo, loindeo, ah, wabidi loindeo, hoodoo, ah, leo, wabidi loindeo, ah, wabidi loindeo, hoodoo, ah, leo, wabidi lo, ayo yo, too late, ah, ah, ayo yo, too late, ah, ah, ayo yo, too late, ah, ah, ayo yo, too late, wabidi loingo.
Hello. This is going to be a listening stream. I'm going to be listening in the background and joining in chat, so you won't hear me again. But I wanted to share why I was sharing this. This is somewhat new. So just so that this is an inside view as to how these people are working and thinking. This website or this channel, Burns and McDonald, I'm just going to let this play right here in the background for a second. They're hiring, build your career, be a part of a bigger story. You see, write the next chapter, take ownership of your projects and your career. Just check this out. And then we're going to listen to one of their recent, you see, what you're looking at there. Build back better. Celebrate our successes. Give back to the community. Yay, sprinklers. It's going to virtual reality. I think you get the idea. So let's just read just there about we're a family of companies bringing together an unmatched team of engineers, construction and craft professionals, architects, and more to design and build our critical infrastructure. Our singular mission since 1898 has been to make our clients successful when we plan, design, permit, construct, and manage projects worldwide. We do it like we own it. As a 100% employee-owned firm ranking in the top leading firms for safety, each professional brings an ownership mentality to our projects. That means we think like owners, working through each challenge until it's resolved, exceeding our client's goal. Well, that's a lot to live up to there, Burns and McDonald. So let me just go to the tab. Oh, no, it's right here. Hang on. It's down here. Yes. This is what we're going to watch. This was just here. Peter Zahan shares his insights at the 2023 Best Practices Forum, exploring systems in transition and their impact on business in the power sector. The forum is an annual gathering of transmission and distribution utility leaders, and it's hosted by this company. So you're going to get a little peek. Now, I'm not saying these people have anything to do with it. I'm telling you, this is how the business people, this is the pitch here. So I hope that you enjoy listening to this. I'll be in chat now.
Okay, we're ready to get started with our afternoon agenda, and I am really pleased to invite again to our Best Practice Forum, Mr. Peter Zahan. Peter is an incredibly unique individual. For those of you that had the pleasure of experiencing his presentation last year in Colorado, we got a lot of great feedback on how he was able to pack the meaning of life, the beginning of the world, why paper clips cost what they do, and the world from A to Z and back again, and does it in a concise manner that makes everybody want more. So we thought, hey, let's have him come out again this year and see what he's got in store for us. So really excited about it. Hope you get as much from it this year as you did last year. For those of you who are new, I hope you do the same. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome Peter Zahan to the stage. Peter.
Hey everybody. It's no one ever brings me in because they want to feel comfortable. So it's always a little odd when I'm back, but this is the industry that is the most notorious for being gluttons for punishment. So let's just go ahead and jump right in. We're dealing with the end of a lot of things in the next 5 years. Here's the partial list. We're going to talk about the ones in the blue arrows, but this is basically my life these days. When you end a system, the globalized system, not everything makes it to the other side. Things look different. Some things do better, but everything changes. And the problem is that all of our business plans assume that we're going back to where we were 5 years ago. And that's not in the math. So my goal here today is to give you an idea, some spotlights on the things that definitely won't go back and how some other things are going to transform and maybe make your life a little bit easier. And we can come back to some of these in Q&A if I don't get to them. So anyway, let's start with the simplest conclusion here. If the product that you need comes on one of these, that's what's going away. Internationalized supply chains, Asia heavy, transoceanic, transpacific. Anything that is on this, you have to question whether it's ever going to be delivered. We now are in a situation where transformers are 36 to 42 months out. Most of those are probably not going to arrive, and you need to plan accordingly. If it comes on one of these, you're probably okay. Roughly 80% of the trade between America and Mexico is on truck, and there's a number of reasons why that's not great from a logistical point of view, but just for identifying what's going to last. Everything in that category probably will. So there, that's the cheat version. You can go look at your supply chains and make your choices accordingly. Let's go ahead and jump into the rest of it though. I know you guys have seen, everyone here has seen me at least once, right? No? Well, okay, this is for you. This is a standard demographic profile. You got children at the bottom, young adults, mature adults, retirees at the top, men on one side, women on the other. Mortality builds it into a pyramid. And when you have a pyramidal demographic like this, there's a few common characteristics. Number one, it's consumption driven, because populations below age 40 consume a lot. They're raising kids, they're building, or they're buying cars, they're building homes. That spending drives most modern systems, 70% in the case of the United States. But their workers don't have a lot of expertise, so the value add is pretty low. They have to import capital because most capital in a system comes from people over age 40, people who the kids have left home and the house has been paid down. And so in a system like this, consumption driven, low investment, high imports, inflationary. This is Korea in the 50s at the dawn of the globalized era. Globalization meant that we could move off the farm and into towns to take industrial jobs. And when you do that, kids go from being free labor to an expense, and adults aren't dumb. So 2 generations on, here's where the Koreans are now. Very different model. People aged 40 to 65 have decades of work experience. They're capital rich. That pays for investment, that pays for the tax base. But there aren't a lot of young people to consume. So you get a more disinflationary economic model that has to export because there's not enough people locally to buy all the stuff. And the whole world has gone down this Korean path at different speeds from different starting points. But the point is, this capital-rich environment that we become used to, this was always never more than a moment in time. And it ends this decade because everyone in the advanced world is aging out. And later this decade, the Koreans, the Germans, the Italians, the Russians, the Chinese will all age out of being investment rich, and they'll be retirement heavy. And we have no idea what that looks like from an economic point of view. It's never happened in human history ever. Now, in the United States, we're kind of in the middle, largely because we have more elbow room. And this means that we're in a different situation from everybody else, but that still means some of the same lessons apply. So number one, the boomers are retiring, largest generation we've ever had, largest worker group we've ever had, largest investment base we've ever had. Half of them have already moved into retirement. The rest will over the next 6 years. And so we know capital costs have to go up. What we've seen so far, we're only about halfway. So capital costs have about tripled in the last 3 years. It's going to triple again. Plan for that. Second, largest generation ever. Another way of saying largest workforce ever. And if you look at the kids at the bottom, the Zoomers, that's our smallest generation ever. It's simple math. Between the boomers leaving and the Zoomers coming in last year, we lost out of the workforce 500,000 workers. It'll be about that same loss again, this year. And that number will increase every year for the next 11 before the annual shortfall peaks at about 900,000 in roughly 2034. Then that number will start to shrink, but we don't expect it to start to grow again in terms of the labor force in large numbers until 2045. So hire, borrow, hire, borrow, hire, borrow. These are the cheapest capital costs and the cheapest labor costs we will have for at least a decade, and in some cases 2. Third, the quality of the incoming labor is very different. Now, the boomers have dominated everything for so long, we think of their examples as normal. They're a social generation. Their kids, the millennials, are a social generation. The incoming ones, the Zoomers, are not a social generation. They're a little pathological. And they are not group workers. They don't want to work anywhere where they're going to see another person or the sky, which makes it hard for you guys to do what you're going to do. So again, labor is the cheapest and most familiar to you right now that it's going to be for the next 20 years. Hire everyone you can. And then finally, there's technology. Technology as a sector requires 2 things. First of all, scads of people in their 20s and early 30s who have malleable minds, who are social, who can work together, who can imagine the future and then build that into a prototype and operationalize it and bring it into mass manufacturing. That has been the millennials for the last 20 years. And they're aging out. The oldest millennials this year turn 44. We're starting to see the leading edge of their midlife crises. And it's delicious. But it also means that that younger block of social people just doesn't exist in the way it has in the past. And the second thing you need for tech is capital. Because until you get to that mass manufacturer, there's no income. You have to pay for all of that up front. And the money just isn't there anymore. So even if everything else goes perfectly smoothly, we know we're entering into a tech winter for at least the next 15 years. The pace of advancement is going to slow considerably. That assumes that it doesn't reverse. Here are the big four economies that we care about. US is obviously the healthiest of the rich world. Mexico, notice how it goes down? Hits the 30-year-old and then goes straight down. Pros and cons of that model. Basically what you're seeing is Mexico was a latecomer to industrialization. They really didn't start the move from farm to city until NAFTA won in the 90s. Now, if they keep aging at that rate in 50 years, we're gonna have a very big problem. But in the meantime, when you've got a lot of people who are entering their 20s and 30s who don't have a lot of kids, it's a much more consumption-heavy pattern. And so Mexico became our largest trading partner last year. It is a role they will not give up in our lives. There may be some problems down the road in the 2070s. We got time to figure that out, so do they. The Germans do not. The Germans are aging faster than the Koreans. This was always going to be their last decade as an industrial economy. It's not that they're running out of kids. That happened in the 80s. They're now running out of working-aged adults. If you get stuff from Germany, it's time to move on. And then there's the Chinese. This was already one of the fastest aging societies in the historical record. And 2 months ago, the Chinese updated the data. They've had a 70% drop in the birth rate since just 2017. That tells me two things. Number one, China will cease to be a coherent economic power, a coherent nation state this decade. And the Han ethnicity will probably vanish from the world this century. It could happen a lot faster because the Shanghai Academy of Sciences, all the brainiacs who are responsible for interpreting the data are like, even the new data is wrong. We've overcounted the population by over 100 million people, and these yellow bars probably don't even exist. Now, that has obviously a whole boatload of complications and consequences. Let's go through them. Let's start with consumption. This is vehicular miles traveled. They're down to 40% of their peak. Now, obviously, COVID is part of that. But in the 6 months since COVID lockdowns ended, they haven't picked up at all. Why? Demographics. The people who are most likely to be mobile are people in their 20s. And we're now discovering that over the course of the last 6 years, they've run out. Or you can look at the purchasing power. Here's vehicle sales. Now, whenever a country modernizes in the current age, everybody wants the same four things. They want a smartphone, they want a refrigerator, they want climate control, typically AC, and they want a car. The red line here is the 12-month moving average. You'll notice not only have they not recovered to pre-COVID levels, they peaked a year and a half before COVID. Now, if you think back on the last 5-6 years, a lot of it has gone down. We've had the Trump administration, which was like living inside of a bullhorn. We had COVID, which scrambled all the data, even if everyone was being conscientious about it, which no one was. China has disappeared into a cult of personality. And the information that we normally would be able to assess either hasn't been there or has been overshadowed. But now that COVID's behind us and the Trump administration is behind us, we're getting a kind of a look under everybody's hood. And we're discovering in the last 5-6 years, we've hit a lot of turning points that we kind of missed. In the case of China, they now say that the Chinese population peaked last year. But as they're interpreting the data, 5 years on, they're discovering actually that probably happened 12 years ago. They found out that the American population became younger than the average Chinese citizen probably 4 years ago. Turns out that was probably back in 2006. India surpassed China to become the largest population this year. That probably happened in 2014. We're finally getting a kind of a clear look, and we've missed China's peak. And it's not that we're at a plateau, it's we're already on the backside of that mountain. And it's only going to accelerate, because if you have had a 70% drop in the birth rate, you are looking at national oblivion. Now, how do you get something like this to grow if there's no consumption? Well, you've got 3 types of economic growth. Your first one's consumption-led. That's the United States. That's Mexico. The second one is export-led. That's Germany. That's Korea. And the third one is investment-led. You basically throw money to build infrastructure, to build industrial plant. And that activity of the expansion is what drives the system. And that has always been China's #1 source of growth. Most of it is driven by debt. And this is a debt graphic. So the orange line, that's corporate, the gray line is government, and the blue is household. I need to put this all in perspective because this doesn't look very dramatic, does it? Well, #1, let's look at corporate because that's the biggest chunk. Back at the beginning of this data in 2006, that was already more debt in absolute terms, not relative, absolute terms than the entire American corporate world, and it then doubled. Second, this is in percent of GDP. So if the Chinese have been having 5 to 10% growth a year, that means the debt has been going up by 10 to 20% a year. So the absolute numbers are much bigger than this suggests. Third, the government debt, that's a bigger build than Trump, that's a bigger build than Obama. And it's all local debt. You know, say what you will about the federal government's debt program. Is it responsible? No. But they have the Fed to back them out, bail them out if they need to. Because ultimately, federal debt is backed by the currency. We're the global currency. The Federal Reserve can change the money supply with a click of a button. You can't do that if it's Chicago. And so they've added $10.5 trillion of local debt in 15 years, which is about 3 times what our total local debt exposure is. And then finally, there's households. Now, their household debt has now surpassed US household debt. But the crazy thing is that's the good news. You guys been watching what's been happening with real estate in China lately? Oh my God. Okay, so ghost cities, we've all heard about them. The red circles are where no one lives in a ghost city. And the orange circles are where governments have moved in, but no one has followed. Now, 2 things from this. #1, most of the real estate was paid for with cash. It was not lent. It's owned outright. When you have an investment-led system that distorts the capital structure so much, people are desperate to find ways to preserve and grow their money. The Chinese government prevents people from sending money abroad, so they have to find something at home. They usually go for real estate. So for your average Chinese citizen, over 85% of their savings is in some sort of real estate function. Here's the crazy part. The overbuild in subprime was 3 to 4% of the housing stock in the United States, and we know how that felt. The overbuild in China is 100 to 200%. They have enough spare condos to house somewhere between 1.5 and 3 billion people. The market value of product in that sort of environment, it's probably 10 to 20% of what they paid for it. So when this goes down, it's not so much that it's a financial hit to the country, no, because it's not on the debt sheet, but it destroys the sum total of the population's life savings. So on top of everything else that the Chinese have going on, you're looking at 1.3 billion people who are probably going to be a little upset in the not too distant future. And that's assuming there's not a war, which there probably will be. This is an energy flow graphic. So the green bars on the left, those are net oil exports. The red on the right are net oil imports. You'll notice how conveniently close together they are. It's about a 5,500 to 7,000 mile sail from the Persian Gulf energy fields to the Northeast Asians based on where you start and where you stop. Now, this route is how everything is shipped right now. The coastal route, it's the short route. The Chinese have dozens of weapon systems that can interfere with that route. So if we get into a shooting war because of something with the Iranians or the Saudis, or let's say Russian energy goes offline and prices go up, there's not enough left for everybody. You get a roving naval war between the Japanese and the Chinese. The tankers won't use that route. They'll take this longer route that avoids the Chinese coast. China has a big navy, 600 ships, twice ours, but about 2/3 of those vessels would fit in this room. Not at the same time, don't be dumb. The point is they don't have range. Only about 8 to 10% of those ships can sail more than 1,000 miles without a refuel. And that 1,000-mile range assumes that they're going slow in a straight line to save fuel, not that they're like dodging missiles. The Chinese cannot project power. They can't control their own sea lanes. They are utterly dependent upon freedom of the seas in order to function. And so if we do get a shooting war, the energy stops, their entire transport system shuts down, the natural gas that they import in liquefied form goes away, their chemical sector dies the next day, and China will disassociate within a year. And since they import 80% of the stuff they used to grow their own food, we also get a famine that kills people, hundreds of millions of people, within 2 years. Now, the Chinese government was well aware of this 5 years ago, but over the last 5 years, it stopped functioning as a government because Xi has purged the system so thoroughly of anyone who is even theoretically competent in order to prevent anyone from rising up from below to potentially challenge him or replace him. And in doing so, he is so terrified the bureaucracy at this point that no one will bring him information at all. As a result, the system's breaking down, and their ability to collect data, much less process it and publish it, has basically stopped. Now, some of these things are ego-driven. So, for example, the Chinese just stopped collecting information on COVID because they didn't want everyone to know how many people died when they did their opening. We just don't know. We don't even have an educated guess, honestly. But some of this stuff really matters. Youth unemployment. We don't know what the status of the next generation is. Patents, which supposedly you need for an information-based society. The information is no longer collected. Bond purchases. How the hell do you have a bond market if you don't know what's on offer and who is buying what? That was supposedly how they were going to get away from an investment-led system, to have a different debt market. That's gone. But the ones that scare me the most are more personal. Political biographies, college dissertations. Because that's how young people get a foot in the system and move up. And Xi's made sure that they can't, so they can never challenge him. So it's just him. Now, my biggest criticism of Barack Obama is he believed he was the smartest person in the room, and he would tell people that. His first meeting with the Joint Chiefs, you got all the 3 and the 4 stars in the room. He said, I'm smarter than all of you. I can do your jobs better than all of you. Let's assume for the moment that Barack Obama was correct. So you're going to do everyone's jobs here and your own. No. Xi has done that for the entire country. Decisions cannot be made without him. The reason he didn't show up to the G20 summit wasn't because he was mad at the Indians, although he was. It's because he had to do it home, because he's the only one who can make decisions. And I think the best way to kind of explain how this is leading to a state collapse is that stupid balloon. Now, I'm not a balloon expert. That's just not in my field. And neither is the American president. But we had pretty much the same response when the thing crossed over from Canada. I'm sure Canada's at fault for this somehow. It was like, shoot the thing down. Let's see what we're dealing with. I mean, the balloon was 350 feet across. It was dangling something the size of an Embraer jet. It was like 14 times the size of the plane that I flew on here yesterday, which, is tiny unless it's dangling from a balloon. So, I mean, obviously it was a spy platform. So let's shoot it down and see what we got. The DOD and the CIA, secretary and director, went to President Biden, like, Mr. President, please don't shoot this thing down. I mean, we're not threatened. We really are not concerned about this. We know where it's going. It's going to float over the missile silos in Montana. But Mr. President, unless you're planning on like firing a few dozen nukes in the next few days, those hatches are going to be closed. They're always closed, Mr. President. The Chinese will get photos of closed hatches from 7 miles away. We are not scared about this. But Mr. President, there's an opportunity here. Because if you let this thing go on its merry way, we'll put a spy helicopter below it and a spy plane above it and every whisper sensor we have, and we will track over the next 9 days. And we'll copy all their cryptography. We'll trace the signals through the civilian information exchange network. We'll see which satellites they're using. And we will trace it back, not to the city, not to the block, not to the building, not to the floor, not to the office, to the terminal that is doing the controls. And Mr. President, we have the best hackers in the world. We will hack that of a terminal. We will find out who is on it, and then we will trace them using signals intelligence and map out their whole world. Mr. President, the Chinese have handed us the intelligence breakthrough of the decade. All you have to do is let the thing float. And then when it gets over North Carolina, we'll shoot it down and we'll get the hardware too, which we did. We now know that Xi was unaware of the balloon's existence until after it was shot down. He's that much in the dark. No one would tell him. We now know that their Ministry of Defense was unaware of it until it crossed into American airspace. It was just some in the Intelligence Bureau who thought this is what Wolf Warrior diplomacy means. This is how you stick it to the Americans. We're seeing breakdowns like this at every government level, in every economic sector. The capacity of the Chinese to make decisions, to flow information has stopped. This was the dumbest thing I have seen any country do in the last 20 years. And if you think back on the last 2 decades, there has been so much dumb. This is what state failure looks like in the early stages. So yes, China, 10 years tops, but it can end so much faster. Let's talk credit. This is the American private credit curve. From the beginning in 2000 to that bump in the middle, that's the subprime build. We doubled total private credit in 7 years. It was too much, it was too fast. And we had a recession that knocked 5% off of headline GDP because of it. Since then, we've picked up the growth, but at something a lot more similar to the century average. Doesn't mean I think we have no concerns in the space. This is just to give us a benchmark. Doubling, 7 years, 5% recession. Got it? Same data, different scale. Here are the Canadians. Now, you'll notice in the early part of the stage, they were doing something similar to us, but a little bit lower. In fact, up until 2007, the Canadians, I would argue, had the healthiest banking sector in the world. Good risk management. And then we had the Great Recession. And the Canadians did something that was very Canadian. Like, Americans just had the worst recession ever. We can totally have a worse recession. And they dismantled all of the risk management they had put into place over the last 30 years, doubled down on every mistake that we made, and their credit swelled, and it contributed to the housing crisis they're having now. Then they got to about 2014, like, maybe we don't want to win this one. And they dialed it back. I'd say they're not out of the woods yet, but it looks better now than it did a decade ago. Here are the Germans. If you're in Germany and you want to buy a house, you don't get your 20% together and go to the bank for the other 80. You tell the bank that you want to buy a house. I'm like, great. So what you need to do is figure out what your mortgage would be if we gave you the loan and deposit that with us on the first of the month. And then again the next month, and then the next month, and the next month for 60 months. Then we will talk about your loan application. You have to prove that you're not a credit risk for 5 years first. There are problems in the German system. A credit overbuild is not one of them. But it is in Greece. 7-fold increase of credit in 7 years. So far, their economic adjustments down has knocked 60% off of GDP. They, I would have said 3 years ago, had another 20% to go, but then COVID happened and all the numbers. Here is Australia. Now, one of the fun things about the United States during subprime is at the height of the crisis in August of 2007, the FDIC chair, the Treasury Secretary, and the Federal Reserve Chair all crowded around a two-top in a bar in Washington, and over the course of about a 45-minute conversation, worked out the bare bones of what eventually became TARP, which was our restitution program for subprime. And that was the model that we followed until the end of the crisis. And it said, in very American terms, that if you f***ed up, you lose. So whether you were the lender or the lendee, there were losses taken. The government money was only there for people to reconstitute. And if you made a mistake, you didn't get everything back. It was something to stabilize the financial sector, not bail out individuals or corporations. And broadly speaking, it worked. Now, the Australians did something very similar when they set up their restitution program, but they didn't call anyone to account. Every mortgage was backed at 100%. Furthermore, they changed the laws. So if you could prove that you could pay your mortgage with a 100% government guarantee, you automatically qualified for a second mortgage, and a third, and a fourth. They haven't had their adjustment yet. And when they do, oh my God. Here is Brazil. You know, we're all like ripped up about our politics, the fact that we might be facing, probably will be facing another Biden-Trump showdown in the general. Old hat for the Brazilians. They've already done it twice. And their candidates, one guy was campaigning from prison where he had been convicted of corruption, not indicted, convicted. And the other guy said that the real problem with those Nazis is they were just way too soft on their domestic opponents. The Nazi won the first round. The guy in prison ran the second time. I'd argue that Brazil has already entered the first of 2 decades of lost time. Here's India. Prime Minister Modi adopted something very similar to what the Australians did, but you only got the money if you were one of his friends. And here are the Chinese. Let me adjust this for you. Are you kidding me? How anyone thinks that China is a serious player on the international playground is beyond me. We are looking at the equivalent of Enron in the 11th hour. The question is, when it falls, what does it do? I'm not really worried about it from a strategic point of view. They can't really reach anyone. I'd be a little nervous if I was Taiwan, obviously. But I'm more worried about the economic consequences. And we're starting to see the kind of faint outlines of what that's going to look like. So good and bad. Let's start with the good. I'm not worried about finance. And that's courtesy, ironically, of the Russians. When the Ukraine war started, every Western financial institution cut their exposure to Russian banks to zero. The Chinese flooded into the space to take over. And that meant that every Western institution was like, whoa, that's like screaming for sanctions. We should probably cut our connections to the Chinese as well. And here we are, a year and a half into the war, and the total exposure of all Western banks to all Chinese banks is less than 1% of their global holdings. That's a happy circumstance. I like that. I'm also not worried about merchandise exports to the Chinese because it's a very protectionist system. They build anything they possibly can. They import as little as they can, which means that the total exposure, the entire world to the Chinese consumer is only about 3.5% of Chinese GDP, which is the lowest goods exposure of any country today. It's not zero, but it's manageable. If you're in the world of commodities, different situation. It's investment driven, building things that they don't need. So whether it's copper or steel or aluminum, they are the world's largest player, often the world's largest importer. And even if we have to rebuild a lot of industrial plant in other places, the industrial plant we build in other places is going to be based on economics and efficiency rather than just build. We're not going to need as much. And so those sectors are going to have some serious downward adjustments. Food's kind of in the middle. The Chinese are the world's largest importer of almost every food product. Their diet has expanded massively in the last 35 years. And that is probably going to break down. But consider this. The last thing a government does before it collapses is somehow take steps to restrict the population's access to food. So of the things that are going to break, it's probably the last one to go, and it'll be a little bit of a softer landing because, you know, we still need food. Tech's going to be an issue. The Chinese are not technically advanced. Most of what they do in manufacturing is relatively low value. And they bring in tech from everyone they can to build that industrial plant. And in terms of tech supply chains, they tend to be on the assembly side of things, with more advanced stuff coming from Taiwan, Thailand, Korea, and the rest. That whole ecosystem is going to end. And there aren't enough fingers and eyes in the world to do assembly on the scale we've become used to. And that's going to probably be what hurts us most of all. This is a document from the American Enterprise Institute on inflation. The yellow arrows are the average inflation since the year 2000, so roughly a 75% increase in inflation over the 22 years. Everything that is below that line has gotten cheaper. Everything above that line has gotten more expensive. Oversimplifying here, but above the line, those are the things that require fingers and eyes. Healthcare, for example, requires people. There's no way around that. And everything below it is something you plug into the wall that beeps and whirs, something that's manufactured. And the Chinese are a critical component of all of that. The biggest hole we're going to have when the Chinese go is the complex supply chains in the world of electronics is going to have to find a new way to put things together. And we haven't developed a new model for that in 60 years, and we're going to have to. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be a disaster, because one of the many things we found out about COVID is that the technology that we've had in pocket for years suddenly can be used at scale. I think the best example I can give you is textiles. Back before NAFTA, most of our textile processing was in places like Kentucky, where it was done by hand. And then NAFTA happened, and it all moved to Mexico because it was cheaper. And then the WTO happened, and it all moved to China and India because it was cheaper. But with COVID, it just stopped coming. And we still wanted clothes, so we had to figure out a different method. And we discovered that if you build a 2-acre facility that's automated with a staff of 2, 1 software engineer, 1 mechanic, that one facility could produce finished clothes at a lower cost per garment than 200 seamstresses in Bangladesh. You bring in the cotton, the machines turn it into thread, turn it into yarn, turn it into cloth, cut it into clothes, assemble it, even do some of the finishing. We would have never known that before 2020. Hopefully, we will figure things like that out in other sectors. But that means we need a lot of investment in an era of constrained capital in order to happen at scale in every single manufacturing sector. We've started. The blue line is what happened with the shale sector. About 2012, that is when the majority of the natural gas consumed on this continent came from shale. A lot of that's waste gas. And so we tripled our investment in a couple of years, and it hasn't fallen back. The refining sector, the chemicals sector, all expanding very quickly. It's actually the biggest build we've seen ever in the history of the country, faster than World War II. The gray bar is kind of the everything else category, and it's sliding up. You'll notice that in the last couple of years, it's picked up quite a bit. This is where we're all noticing it, though. This is electronics and computing. Now, a lot of people are like, isn't this all the IRA and the CHIPS Act? And that's some of it. Can I even get back here? Yeah. Okay. This spot right here, that's where the CHIPS Act and the IRA were passed. So all of this happened before. The industrial base is expanding significantly, but we need that kind of jack up for absolutely everything. There will be winners and losers. There's no way around that. On the high end, if you want a semiconductor fab facility, you need a lot of people in their 20s and 30s who are really clever. And the greatest concentration of those people in the country is the Colorado Front Range and the Arizona Sun Corridor. I know everybody thinks about Arizona and they think old people. They do have a lot of old people in Arizona. However, they're all white. Arizona actually has a very healthy demography. It doesn't have a labor shortage. It has a bilingual training problem. Different problem. And so you're seeing these areas pick up most of the investment for that because they've got a lot of green space. It's not taking over farms, so the land is cheap. And most of the people who move in are in their 20s and their 30s, and they tend to be very highly educated. That's where the concentration of labor for that sector happens to be, and policy is matching. You want to do automotive, you're looking at either the Great Lake regions or the South. Now, the Great Lake regions is all unionized. And so everything that has to do with internal combustion engines is going there. And we've seen that expand massively. Pros and cons. Pros, there's a lot of industrial plant there. You can rehabilitate a lot of the brown space. It's actually a relatively light carry from an investment point of view. The downside is they're not moving into any of the new stuff. And they probably can't, not just because it's unions, but because there's a population lid. This area has seen out-migration pretty robust over the last 30 years. There aren't enough young people to stock a lot of new industrial plant. For that, you go to the South. And so most of the foreign investment is in the South. Most of the new battery facilities in the South. Almost the EV construction is in the South. But the place that is just going to kick ass and take names is the Texas Triangle, especially Houston, because you've got almost 20 million people, about a third of whom have immigrated within the last 10 years, tends to be younger than the national average. They have a footprint in Mexico. They can access that part of the supply chain. And Houston has a foot in the energy corridors as well. So all of the inputs that you need for all of the stuff we need to do is already there. Now, let's talk about the Mexicans. This is a population density map. The deep red, those are the urban cores. The yellow are small towns and suburbs. And if you look north of the border, that pattern, dense urban cores, suburbs, small towns, as a geographer, excuse me, that tells me that it rains. Rain makes farms, farms make small towns make suburbs, suburbs make inner cities. South of the border, you don't have that because it's desert. Pros and cons. Pros, it's oligarchic. There's no interaction among the urban centers in Mexico. Physical interconnections are very, very thin. So only a few families run everything and have since independence over a century and a half ago. Which means if you're an American and you're looking for a partner, all you have to do is go south, figure out who's in charge, knock on their door, introduce yourself. 2 weeks later, you'll be leaving with a blistering hangover, a godchild, because you're part of the family now, and a fistful of signed contracts that you know you can rely upon because you now have a personal connection. Biggest downside of that, though, is once you've gobbled up the labor in that urban area, you're done. Mexicans are not mobile in the way that Americans are. They don't move within their country very much to take jobs because the infrastructure doesn't support it. And the cities stop, and then you just have desert. There's no intermingling at the edges. And the Texans have been working on this for 40 years, and they have already gobbled up probably 80% of the labor that was available. Which means if we're going to rely on the Mexicans to do what we need to do, and oh my God, we need to rely on the Mexicans to do what we need to do, the northern section of the country is not the solution. It's got to be the center. The problem is that the infrastructure isn't there to support it. There are only three, I'll point, the three black lines, those are the only three intermodal freight facilities within the entire country. They don't interconnect. They just go south on a specific corridor, and they don't really branch off. And if the northern Mexicans have already been metabolized, we have to make it all the way down to Mexico City. That's 1,000 miles away, which means we need to invest at least $1 trillion in Mexican infrastructure in order to reach at scale the 50, 60 million people who live in the center of the country. And we have to do so in a way that doesn't make the Mexicans think that we're trying to take over, which is kind of what we're trying to do. This is going to be touchy, but if we don't pull it off, we will not have the labor to do what we need to do. Because if we still want stuff in a post-China world, we need help to build it. We need a differentiated labor market. And the Mexicans are the only ones within arm's reach that can help with that. There are other players that are further abroad, but we can't integrate with them the same way we can integrate with a neighbor. The Southeast Asian countries look pretty good to me. Thailand is the fastest aging one, but it still has at least another 25 years. The Indonesians and the Vietnamese are great. In fact, the Vietnamese are kind of scary. They've expanded their higher educational system with technical skills in mind. 40% of college grads in Vietnam are STEM graduates. They are attempting, and it looks like they're going to pull it off, to leapfrog over China from a technological point of view, and they will probably achieve that within the next 3 or 4 years. There's also a geography situation that is very helpful. On the left, you're looking at a vegetation map, basically, and the green is tropics. And when you think about building infrastructure in tropics, in mountains, on peninsulas, on islands, it's an expensive, ugly business because you really can't get economies of scale. But there's pros and cons to that too. The con is that these countries have never gone to war with one another like they have in, say, Europe or Northeast Asia. There's not a lot of bad blood. And that means that almost everyone started out in tropical agriculture. And if there's one thing that everyone in tropical agriculture can agree on, is it's that no one wants to be in tropical agriculture. In temperate zone agriculture, there's a value chain. You don't have to do it all by hand. You can get a tractor, you can get a combine, you can get a spreader. In the tropics, no. Tropical fruits, harvested by hand, tended to by hand, transported by hand. You can't have a combine harvesting mangoes. It's all unskilled labor. And so whenever people in tropical ag have a chance, they move out and they go to the cities, and that means population density. Their cities are wildly overpopulated for the skill set of the labor. And that means this is the most competitive part of the world for value-added manufacturing. This is where we're going to see a big footprint expand. Already has. You're talking about 1 billion people. There are already more people in coastal Southeast Asia than there are in coastal China. They're probably the biggest winners in the world after Mexico. But it will look different. Population density again. You'll notice that there aren't threads. When you look at a more normal population structure in an industrialized or industrializing country, you get your urban hub, and then you've got threads of highways that are densely settled going out to the next population center. And that allows for what we consider to be multi-step supply chains, because there's multiple population centers linked together tightly. You can move things back and forth through the system. That doesn't happen in Mexico. It's desert, it's mountainous, it's jungle, combination thereof. And so each urban core will be good, very good at 1 or 2 things. And that's it, because they don't have access to a complementary system. So what we do in the United States is we might make the frame, we send it across, they put in the spark plugs, they send it back, we put in the computer system, we send it back, they put in the seats, and it's going to different cities each time. And it's that back and forth that makes it work. But they can't do that at scale within their own system. They have to have that partner. The Vietnamese do not. It's a much more traditional system from our point of view. And so the Vietnamese can do top to bottom manufacturing. The only thing they have to worry about are the components that they can't make themselves, which are substantial. But you can have Vietnam as almost a one-stop shop for most of what we need. We just going to kind of add the dusting of the tech that's necessary to make it work. It's cheaper to do. Unfortunately, it's 7,000 miles further away, so we can't do the back and forth. 2 different models. All right, let's talk products. If you're at the top of this, you don't know who your 3rd tier suppliers are, much less your 13th. If you're at the bottom, you can probably fit your entire supply chain on the back of a cocktail napkin after throwing back a few bourbons. If you're on the left, or excuse me, on the right, you're already within the NAFTA system. If you're on the right, you're dependent on the Chinese. Couple examples. Energy. American energy is made with American capital. It's on American pipelines, American workers going to American refineries, ending up with an American consumer. And that is not simple at all. 1,400 supply chain steps for the iPhone, 91% of which involve mainland China in some fashion. The new iPhone just came out a couple weeks ago. You might want to buy 2. We're probably getting close to the point where this is the last one. Here's everybody else. Going to pull out a few of these. Automotive. Courtesy of NAFTA 2, over 90% of the supply chains for autos sold in North America are manufactured in North America. Don't mean to suggest we're not going to have some hiccups, but the core of it has already worked and the rest is just network effects. That's not bad. In terms of foreign investors, the Europeans are of the belief that they can bring in all the parts and just assemble it here. That's not going to work very well. The Asians have figured out that they need to actually do the manufacturing here. So they're probably north of 70% manufactured within North America, where most European companies are less than 10. Heavy vehicles are going to be a problem, though. When you have globalization, it's very common for countries to put their thumbs on the scale to encourage parts of the industrial plant to be in their countries, especially if it's something they can technologically do without a lot of help. As big as they are, a forklift is actually simpler than a passenger car in terms of the equipment and the construction. And since not everybody needs a forklift, it's not like you're going to have these facilities everywhere. So the Chinese really have dominated that space. So forklifts, dump trucks, construction equipment, agricultural equipment, we're going to have a real problem when the Chinese go away. But it is a relatively easy fix because anyone who can do automotive at scale can also do heavy equipment at scale. It's just a question of the numbers being right. And nothing like half of the stuff vanishing from the world is going to make the numbers right. That's where I'm worried the most. A successful electronics and computing sector requires a lot of different labor price points because the person who does the plastic molding is not the person who does the die cast or pulls the wire or builds the chip or does the software or polishes the lenses. That's a different step with a different skill set at a different price point. And one of the many reasons that the East Asians are so good at this is you've got 11 different labor sets within one extended market. And they can all specialize at what they do best. We don't have that in North America. We have 2 price points, us, Mexico, that's it. And so we have to change how this is all done. The textiles example gives me hope that we can, but I have no idea in hell how, because we haven't had to figure it out yet. But we're going to have to real soon. And we probably are going to have to do it without northern Mexico because that's already spoken for. All right, here's where things get a little messy. Not all semiconductors are made equal. We all hear about
northern Mexico.
Wants to do. That's for a very, very specific kind of chip. 10 nanometer and smaller, the most advanced one in the world. Now, today, 92% of those come from Taiwan, 8% from South Korea. If every facility that is under construction in the United States because of the CHIPS Act ultimately comes to fruition, we will be making less than 5% of the global total. It's a start. It's not huge. The Koreans and the Taiwanese have been working on this for a long time. Here's the problem. The Taiwanese manufacture most of them. They fabricate most of them. But most of the technology that allows them to do so is not Taiwanese. They just have the end production. There's a coalition of over 9,000 companies worldwide, half of which only produce one product for one customer that ends up in a Taiwanese facility. You pull any of those out of the constellation, the whole thing stops until you repair the constellation. We're going to have to rebuild an entire environment in order to continue putting these chips together. That's going to take a decade. All it takes is one country falling out. I'm personally most concerned about the Germans on this one. Now, on the other extreme, you've got the dumb chips, the 90 nanometer and bigger. This is your Internet of Things, your smart blender, the shower brush that sings to you, your smart lights. 80% of those are made by the Chinese, and they can do that without outside help. The other 20% is kind of a split between Japan and the United States. Now, if the Chinese were to vanish tomorrow, obviously the Internet of Things would just die. I would argue that's not that big of a deal. And we have the technology, we have the knowledge. We don't have to reinvent anything. We just need a couple of years to build low-end fab facilities. The Mexicans are very interested in getting into that space. The problem that they face is bilingual technical language skills. If you've got kids who are looking for a way to make a lot of money really quick, tell them to learn how to assemble chips. and to do it in Spanish and go down there and be translators, because that is going to be the single biggest friction point in the bilateral relationship for the next decade or two. And then everything in the middle, 10 to 90, that's your car. That's your planes. That's most power management systems. That's smart meters. We're probably okay there because those are made in Germany and Italy and here in Japan and Korea, Taiwan, even a little bit in China with imported gear. That looks okay. It's the high end I'm really worried about, because those high end chips, that's AI. All these server farms are getting built to do AI at scale. No, we're not going to have the chips for it. That's the iPhone. We're not going to have the chips for them. That's electric vehicles. Electric vehicles have 2 to 3 grand worth of chips, and they're all either the very high end or the very low end. We won't be able to sustain it and everything that comes from it. Now, for you guys as world more specifically, here's your lives. Yeah, there's no way to fix that fast. Order from everyone? Find a way? Counting on half of them not making it. That's the biggest sticking point you guys have by far. This doesn't look that great either. This is space the Chinese dominate utterly, and replacing that at scale is not a 2-year program. It's not just the manufacturer. The assembly requires a lot of fingers and eyes and a lot of quality control, and there is no other country in the world that can step into that space quickly. So we're talking about a significant build out that's not just capital intensive, but is very labor intensive, and it is not clear where, if that can happen with today's technology. This stuff we kind of do in our sleep. Oops. That's weird. It's advancing on my cheat screen, but it's not advancing on the big one. Do you guys need to do it manually from now on? There's a disconnect. They keep inviting me to events. I'm like, no. Okay, there we go. Okay, the stuff in the middle. I'm sorry, no, let me, this is the stuff we do in our sleep. The United States is a weird economy in that we're very, very high end and very, very low end at the same time. We have a lot of elbow room, we have a lot of forest, we have a lot of wood, and courtesy of the shale industry, we have a lot of things that are energy intensive that we're the world's most competitive. None of that's in danger. And this is the stuff that the Mexicans are going to be helping us with. The slower China breaks down, the more time we have to build the industrial plant that we need to give you guys the guts of what you need. But that means working with the Mexicans as forward-looking as possible to build the stuff out so we don't start the day that stuff from China just vanishes. Oops. There we go. My biggest concern about China is the information blockade in there has now become so intense that we just can't get information at all. And we might not find out that the government has collapsed until the stuff just stops arriving. We're not going to have a lot of warning. Okay. Uh-oh. All kinds of weird stuff is happening down here now. Can you guys bounce it forward for me? There we go. All right, I showed you guys this last year, population density map on this side, economic map on this side. The areas that are populated are also the areas that are economically viable. It's a pure weather thing. Russia has weather. People live where it's less. The Russian strategy is pretty straightforward. Expand out of the weather or the area that's decent until you hit a series of geographic barriers that you can't shove tanks through. And then forward position your military in the access points between them. Ukraine is in the unfortunate position of not controlling those access points, but it's on the way to one in Romania and one in Poland. So whenever the Russians are done with Ukraine, if they can win, they will move on to the next line of countries, 5 of which are in NATO. American, Western foreign policy is very simple. Prevent them from having that opportunity. Now, here we have the Ukrainian demographic structure. After independence in 1992, over a third of the population either left or died. some of the lowest birth rates we've ever seen. Another third of the population since the war has fled as refugees, mostly women and children. So this is pre-war data. We're very close to the point in Ukraine where they will not have the population density that is required to maintain industrial level infrastructure. So whether it is food or steel or coal or it's just stuff transiting, Ukraine is not going to survive the next 30 years, even if they win the war. There's another problem in that space. This is, hang on, my hair's falling apart here. This is the Russian permafrost. It's a geological phenomenon. You go 10 to 30 feet down and you hit a layer where it never melts. But the top chunk melts in the summer and turns into a bog. It is the most difficult environment in the world for mineral extraction. So the Russians have the most expensive upfront cost to bring stuff online. You basically have to wait for it to freeze solid. You run a berm out to your production site. You run a rail line or a pipe or a road along that berm, and then you have a pad that you drill from when it's frozen, because you can't drill through mud. It's a very dynamic landscape, because if an aquifer cracks open, everything just kind of slides and follows the aquifer. Or maybe it drains down, in which case you just get a sinkhole pit that opens. Or maybe there's no aquifer and you just get a warm summer, and the vegetation that's been frozen for eons starts to thaw, starts to decompose. Decomposing vegetable matter gives off methane, and the whole land buckles. Which means that the Russians have the highest maintenance costs for any mineral production in the world. Here's the problem. Russian population structure. Now, about the time that people who were 15 were getting born, 2004, 2005, that's when the Russians stopped collecting data and just started making it up. So you've got that big gouge in the 20-somethings, post-Cold War birth rate collapse, and then you have fabricated data. There probably are only half as many children as this data would suggest. The Russian educational system collapsed back in 1985. So we had a collapse in the birth rate, a collapse of the educational system, which means that the youngest people in Russia who actually have technical skills at scale, they turned 62 this year. The year before the Russians started fabricating data, the life expectancy for the average Russian male was 67. They already had the worst skilled labor pool relative to their population and their needs in the world, and they're very close from simply losing all of it. The maintenance on the Russian systems, the development on the Russian systems, hasn't been done by the Russians for the most part. It's been done by BP or ExxonMobil, and especially the Dutch and the Germans, and all that went to zero when the war started. So whether it's sanctions, war damage, or simple lack of maintenance, we need to prepare for a world where everything that the world has become reliant upon from the Russians, palladium, platinum, oil, gas, even timber, just doesn't come anymore. There's another angle to it that's a little uglier. Now, this guy, you can see where the ethnic Russian territories are in the top left. You got Turkic minorities off to the east and the south. The problem is this is not an ethnic map. It's a population change map. The green zones are where population growth is happening roughly on par with Florida and has for 4 decades. And the red zones are population losses roughly equivalent to Detroit and has been for 4 decades. Almost all the raw materials are produced in the green zones that are not controlled by ethnic Russians, where they're experiencing population growth, but they're shipped through and processed in the red zones, where the last bits of the skilled labor pool are, that is in terminal decline. So you can add demographics to the reasons that we need to kiss the Russian stuff goodbye as well. Not to mention that this is going to be a very politically unstable region in the not too distant future because of the mismatch. One of the many reasons that the Russians feel that the Ukraine war is necessary is if they can get to kind of that outer crustal defense that they used to have in the Soviet period, then they can focus their forces internally to police this demographic flip. They're fighting for time. If they can pull this off, they probably buy themselves another 50 years. If they fail, they're gone within 20. All right, let me take a big dump on green tech. We talked about this a little bit last time I saw you guys. I think I even showed you this graphic. I mean, oversimplifying here, but thermal power, internal combustion engines, not all that complicated. You light a match, you start a fire, you capture the heat in some way. Can't do that with an EV system, can't do that with green tech. The process of producing the energy, transmitting the energy, storing the energy requires an order of magnitude more materials and different materials. We're looking here at an EV versus an ICE vehicle. You can just see at a glance. And then here's the same kind of idea, but for generation, with solar and wind at the top, conventional thermal at the bottom. We need 3 times as much copper by 2030. We need 20 times as much lithium. We need 10 times as much nickel. There isn't enough on the planet to pull that off. And the Russians are a top 3 producer of these things. So it can't happen. It's not physically possible with today's technology for the world. There is one way it might be possible for us. This is where all the stuff comes from that is not what we would consider to be part of our friends and family network. If we use our military, which is done with the war on terror, which has recruited and rested and rearmed, and we go and conquer all of these places, and we run a Belgian imperial-style extraction empire and bring all of it home, then we can do the green transition, but no one else. Now, this is not a recommendation. I'm just saying that the path we're on, this is the only way that it works. And even that would not be enough because you still have to turn it into processed material. Lithium ore is useless. You have to turn it into lithium metal. The red bars are the stuff where that processing happens in either China or Russia. And even that's not enough. You have to talk about finance. Here you're looking at the full cycle cost for a natural gas combined cycle plant. The blue is the construction, the siding, the building. The gray is the fuel, full life cycle. This is a model you're familiar with. This is what you all do. The idea is it's a subscription model. You pay as you go. That doesn't work for green tech. For green tech, it's almost all up front. This is wind. Capital costs have tripled. They will triple again. I think most of the plans that were put out there 4 years ago assumed that there would never be a 100 basis point increase in capital costs. We've now gone up by 500. We have another 500 to go. The market can't support this. The IRA will help maybe sand down some edges. But we're going to have to do something that in the United States we really don't like doing. We're going to have to choose what we want to focus on. The smart play would be to put solar panels where it's sunny, not in Massachusetts. Put wind turbines where it's windy, not in Florida. And wire the power to where we actually live. But we're not going to do that. That's the smart thing. All right, another matrix. If you're at the top, you want the government out of your personal life. If you're at the bottom, you think the government should regulate social norms in some way. If you're on the right, you want the government out of your wallet. And if you're on your left, you think the government should intervene in people's wallets to get the resources it needs to remake society in some way. And you can kind of combine these things. So if you're at the bottom right, an economic and a social conservative, you're kind of opposed to food stamps on principle because famine builds character. And if you're at the top left, a social liberal and an economic conservative, you want to bring all of the bureaucrats in Washington together for a big party where you'll serve arsenic cake. Here are our political factions. The single biggest effect that Donald Trump had is he elevated a faction to prominence that really hadn't voted before. Most of the people who voted for him the first time he ran for president hadn't voted in the previous 4 presidential elections. A lot of different estimates for how many people that is, but all of them are north of 10 million voters. They are now not simply the single largest voting bloc in the country. They've taken over the Republican Party. Because in calling to these people, Trump ended up picking fights with what he would call the rhinos. People who were the traditional leaders of traditional leaders of the policy. He ejected them from his White House. He campaigned against their candidates in Congress, and he completely purged them from the Republican national conventions. They're not even present in the decision-making apparatus of the party now. And in effect, they've become swing voters. But he was able to attract other factions that were closer to his social conservative core supporters. And a lot of people have switched sides. This is the MAGA coalition. This is the Republican Party of today. This has lots of consequences. Let's focus on 3. First, the unions are swing voters. That hasn't happened in a century and a half. We're entering a period where we need to double the size of the industrial plant. How many of those jobs do you think are blue collar? We have a labor shortage, and we will for at least another decade, probably 2. We're going to see the greatest increase in union activity and union power in the history of the Republic in the next 10 to 20 years. The business community are swing voters now. That hasn't happened in the last 150 years. And this is crazy because, you know, the unions versus business, that tug of war, that is modern economics. Their discussions, their debates, their compromises, their negotiations, that is our economic policy for 5 generations. And these people are right now not even in the room. Part of the reason why economic policy out of both the Obama and the Trump administration just seems so nuts is because there's no one in either administration that can do math. In fact, on both sides, they're kind of offended by the concept that you need to be able to do math to run an economy. The group that most fancies themselves economists in the Biden administration today are the Greens. Until such time as the unions or the business or both end up in one coalition or the other, economic policy making, decisions, choices about where we need to focus are going to be completely divorced from reality. And this is going to last bare minimum for another presidential cycle. Now, we will get through this. The idea that the 2 economically most capable, competent, and numerous voting blocs on these topics are going to remain outside the political system, that's silly. But it's going to take time for us to figure out where they're going to land. And the political coalitions are going to look very, very different on the other side. So best of luck, because not only will you not be getting good guidance or regulation, there isn't a logic to it. And that's just the environment you're operating in at a time when you're going to have to at least double the grid. No pressure. Okay. If you're looking for more, the link on the left goes to the newsletter and video log. It is free, and I will never share your data with anyone. And this guy, if you see or read something you're like, I would have paid for that, whatever you think you would have paid, send it here, MedShare. They are a charity that I support. They provide medical assistance to communities who have lost the ability to look after themselves for reasons that are not their fault. So, for example, if the Russians bomb your power grid, like they started doing again last week in Ukraine, MedShare steps in with diesel generators and fuel for hospitals. How we feeling? Okay. I'm going to make the PDFs of this available for everybody. I have no problem with taking photos or whatever. But let's go ahead and do some Q&A.
We have about 15 minutes for questions.
He's
so,
taking photos, everybody. You can get a photo.
For
What a
line, but
BA.
anyone want to raise your
Oh,
hand?
you can ask without me knowing who it is?
We go first.
We do have one that came in through the app, and it is way more fun if you just ask them live. So feel free to raise your hand. But the one that came through on the app is, how important is it going to be able to speak Spanish in the United States or have Latino leaders within our private organizations based on everything that you're talking about today?
Yeah, so the Hispanic population in the United States, well, I mean, let's be honest, it's 80% Mexicans. The Mexican population in the United States is the fastest growing demographic. It is the youngest demographic. It is the demographic that has seen an increase in its value add and its educational system most quickly. And then, of course, it's obviously an interface with Mexico proper. So it really matters where you are. The closer to the southwest border you happen to be, the bigger this issue is, but it is going to be an issue for everyone. They're also the consumers of the future. Now, a couple things to keep in mind. Number one, they are the demographic that we have absorbed in this country most quickly. Spanish disappears from Mexican migrants typically within 1 to 2 generations. That's the fastest ever. One of the really weird cultural things with Hispanics and especially with Mexicans is a lot of them think of the term gringo as an aspiration, not as a pejorative. And if you ask a second generation Hispanic, they will probably on census forms say they're white. They see it as a cultural term, not a racial term. Now, does that mean I don't think you should work on Spanish skills? Not what I'm saying. I'm saying it might not be as critical on this side of the border as you think it is. The other side of the border, Spanish. And let's be honest, the interface with the Hispanics of Mexico is going to be far more productive, far more cost effective, and far more important than anything we have ever done with East Asia. And based on demographics, it will be for at least the next half century. So that is the future of not just your market and a large part of your workforce, but what allows you to do everything else. So yes, I would invest in it. I'm just saying you might not need it for what you think you need it for.
Hi, I'm Jim Mooney from New York Transco, just so you know who's asking you the question. What role do you think AI plays in some of these equations going forward?
I forgot that.
There's a big,
It's
a lot
probably
of
not
concern
going to.
everywhere for everything.
Okay, so it probably isn't going to, because those AI chips, the 10 nanometers and smaller, those are the ones we're most likely to lose and not have for about a decade while we rebuild the structured environment that allows us to build them at scale. Now, they're not going to go to zero, but we're going to have to choose what we're going to put them into. Do we put them into EVs? Do we put into power management systems where, there's one of those chips is in every smart meter for a house that also has solar panels. So that in theory is a bigger market than what we do for iPhones. Or do we put them in electric vehicles? Or do we put them in server farms? Because we're not going to have enough for all of that. We're going to have enough probably for one of those applications. And until we have that shortage, we haven't made up that decision. But the idea that we're going to be doing this at scale and have massive server farms with millions of these chips, that can't happen. Now, with ChatGPT, we're seeing that this technology has probably now passed the operational stage. So all we need are the chips. The question is, how long is it going to take us to rebuild that pipeline? And I would say 8 to 12 years.
Daniel Sierra Burns and McDonald. Sorry, over here. My apologies.
Thanks.
So I guess you're talking about the Mexican market and the labor there. What happens after we use all that up, I guess, per se? What's the next country that you see coming down the road?
All of this is very inflationary because we're trying to do a lot with limited supply of capital and labor. If we do succeed in building the infrastructure down into central Mexico and the industrial plant does take form the way that the market seems like it's going to push for, it's going to be the same thing we did here. When we gobbled up all available labor in roughly 1990, just kind of put a stake in the ground, we found out we had to go up market. And we had to get better at using capital and labor more effectively. And that's when we saw our productivity skyrocket. I would expect that we would have a secondary issue like that in the United States. And then Mexico will go through a 1990s style boom as they are forced to move up the value added scale. Now, Mexico over the last 30 years has moved up the value added scale at a faster rate than any country ever before. They're on average, I'd say, twice as productive as the average Chinese, and their compensation is less than half as much. So they're already skewing towards being amazing. This will just speed it up, but it will be inflationary.
All right. Brandon Young Management. Question for you is around technical education.
Okay.
Where are you seeing the trend is going, or will we run out of the younger generation wanting to go into more technical related roles like engineering, power, utility?
Yeah.
Talk about that and when that's going to end.
It's not going to end in the next 15 years. Two things. Number one, the type of work we're probably going to see have the most price pressure is machine shops. It's a skill set that expands pretty quickly, but on small scale. And we're going to have to do a lot of the manufacturing and the maintenance for things that you would normally just buy an entirely new component relatively close to your headquarters, because it's going to have to be a patch job. We're not going to have the production that's necessary. Second, you're probably all going to have to establish training programs, not in high schools, but in elementary schools, to build your own inflow for these jobs. Because in an environment of very strict and increasing labor shortages, whoever gets their hooks into the kids first is likely to be the ones who then get the labor when it's time. And the time to start on that was yesterday. Because we won't see to build your own inflow for these jobs. Because in an environment of very strict and increasing labor shortages, whoever gets their hooks into the kids first is likely to be the ones who then get the labor when it's time. And the time to start on that was yesterday. Because we won't see, we have to wait for the millennials kids to enter the market. That's 2045. And so you're all fighting for a small pool of antisocial children.
Hi, Nelson Goes, IC Engineering Construction. So you seem like you're bearish on China, right? And
That's a word you could use, yeah.
so, and to borrow your phrase, you said, Russia is buying time by their current,
The war.
Yeah, war. Yeah. How do you view that kind of thought process applying to China as, if Taiwan is a $14 trillion semiconductor market, and you're saying they don't have enough adults in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So how do you see that playing out and them making a move towards Taiwan in the next, 5, 10 years?
So because of the information vacuum in China now, it's impossible to know whether or not there's going to be an attack, because Xi doesn't talk with anyone. There's no one's phone you can bug to find out what he's thinking. Also, if the Chinese were to make a move on Taiwan, even if they capture it in a matter of 6 weeks without a shot fired, they don't know how to operate those semiconductor facilities because they can't operate their own. They use imported labor to do all of the quality checks on all of the wafers. And the ones in Taiwan are the world's most advanced. The ones in China are very much the other side. So if they got them, they would just be big paperweights. And obviously that would remove semiconductors for the rest of us, but it wouldn't really help them technologically. And it would trigger, among other things, the United States to act militarily. And it's not like we would confront the Chinese in the South China Sea or anything. We'd probably just put a couple destroyers in the Indian Ocean basin and cut the energy flow and cut the ability of them to import the things they need to grow their own food. So China would be facing a national collapse within a couple of years if they do pull the trigger on Taiwan. Normally, I would say that this would mean that they wouldn't even consider it. But again, Xi is now in an information black box, and we can't rule it out. All I can tell you for sure is that one way or another, some country involved in the supply chain somewhere is going to crack. I'm actually more concerned about Germany than I am about Taiwan, but it would have the same impact. The Germans specifically make the lenses that allow all of the lithography to happen. No lenses, no lithography, no chips. The hope, because people seem to like me to say things that are hopeful, is that there is a new lithography technology that is coming out that has fewer parts and doesn't require neon, which we're dependent on the Russians and the Chinese for, that might have a simpler supply chain. But if we ironed out all the kinks of that today, it's not going to be applied at scale in Taiwan within 3 years. So there are potentially ways forward here, but I find it unlikely that we're going to be able to avoid a disruption in that specific market. It's too vulnerable to too many things. But probably not that one. Probably. If it does happen, well, then it's all gone. Yeah.
Over here. Hey, Peter, you talked a lot about Xi Jinping in China. I just wonder what your thoughts are on Vladimir Putin in Russia. What's going on?
Okay, well, I mean, all world leaders, democratic or otherwise, have problems with narcissism and ego. We're not immune to that. The question is how honest you are about your own capacity. So Putin has also established a bit of a cult of personality and has also purged the system of people who might rise up to replace him. But he started from a much lower base, which has shaped how much he's willing to carve out. So at the end of the Cold War, well, sorry, let me go back, 1983, there was a coup in the Soviet Union, and the intelligence services took over, purged all the other factions from the Communist Party. This is the Andropov coup. And Andropov, Chernomyrdin, and Gorbachev, they were the first three, ran the country until the end. Putin is part of that clique, and the intelligence professionals took over after the fall and have run it until now. And Putin has bit by bit removed people who he thought was threatening, and he hasn't done a lot to bring up a new generation from below. So Putin's inner circle today is less than 10 people, half of whom are utterly incompetent. If you ever see anything by Dmitry Medvedev, the former president, he's the most incompetent of them. You can ignore whatever he says. But there are a few of them that actually do provide him with advice and context. So I think the best example I can give you is if you go back to the January before the, I'm sorry, the March, and the words. March, just after the war began, when Putin was making all the nuclear threats, the US ambassador was dispatched, and the message was something like this, like, Mr. President, just think of things from a little different angle here. You remember back in January when you decided and you gave the order for the day the war was going to start, and you were in the bunker under the Kremlin that was completely sealed. It was walk-in safe, no electronics, no notes. And an hour after you left that meeting, we published the notes of the meeting in the media. That was our way of telling you that we know where your person is at any given moment. So if you think you can fling a nuke into the Western Hemisphere, and the first half dozen we send back are going to go anywhere except straight up, you're out of your mind. So stop it. The point is that Putin has meetings. He has people, he's discussed things, which means you can hack into the fax system and the email, you can tap the phones, there's ways to learn. And as bad as the demographic situation is in Russia, there's still a massive producer and exporter of food and energy, whereas China now has no inner circle, no communication, no way to find out anything, and are the world's largest importer of pretty much everything that keeps people alive. So in the worst case scenario for the Russians, they will still persist longer than in the best case scenario for the Chinese. China's almost over. The Russians have at least another decade and a half to 2 decades. But this is still probably the last generation of Russian leadership.
So, Peter, with the labor shortages you articulated and sort of this focus on ESG across the world, how do you reconcile the idea of undocumented workers or forced labor really being something that folks want to purge out of their supply chain? Is that I'm not going to ask, is it possible, but is it happy talk to say that, or can you?
No, I think it's reasonable. 2 things to keep in mind. Number 1, forced labor, different hemisphere. A lot of the stuff from that other hemisphere is going to stop anyway. And forced labor is going to be some of our least of our concerns when it comes to human rights issues. So I would expect those supply chains to wither for independent reasons. Second, business community, swing voters. One of the things that people missed about Governor DeSantis of Florida is that he hasn't gone to war with Disney. He's gone to war with the Florida business community. ESG, is it doing a good job? Questionable. Is it taking us to where we need to go? I don't know. But since the business community is no longer part of the conversation, they are trying to figure out where they fit into American society. ESG is a component of that. It's an internal conversation. And so every business is approaching this from their own way, based on their own circumstances, their own geography, their own politics, their own workforce. And of course, they're all coming up with different conclusions, some of which are, But when people on the left or the right yell at business about ESG, business just gets pissed off because they're doing the best they can when they're not allowed in the room. So when I hear people like Ramaswamy or DeSantis screaming about ESG, it's like all you are doing is making it easier for the business community to never support the Republican Party again. So there are consequences, and we're going to see them in the presidential and the general election next year. but they're going to be unpredictable in a way that we're not used to seeing out of that community. We're used to the business community being the adults in the room. Now, more specifically to your question about child labor, since there are no standards in ESG, since every company comes at it from their own angle for their own reasons, there is no pattern, in my opinion. So we're going to be waiting to see what happens in terms of international capacity to build this stuff. And those countries are not going to snap in a neat order or all at once. So I hate to say this, this is a tier 3 supplier issue. And there is not going to be a database that allows us to map this on its way down.
Hi, Andrea Hubianco from RWE. I just have a question. Do you think IQ demographics plays a role into this global dynamic, and also some population attributes like flexibility, adaptability?
That's all cultural stuff. And yes, it does. It's a lot harder to map out than just the sheer numbers, but there's just certainly indications that different cultures are better or worse at doing different things at different stages of the production cycle. So for example, Americans are very good at brain work. We have the highest value-added designers in the world. The Mexicans are great at production. They're the highest value-added manufacturers in the world. But if you were to increase the cost of labor in Mexico by a factor of 5, they'd probably give us a run for our money. It's not an issue of us or them being smarter or dumber than the other one. They're at a different stage of their economic cycles and their growth, and we have different infrastructures to work with. So I've never seen a study that looks at race from an IQ point of view that has ever held up. Every time I've ever seen it, they've kind of thrown it out. It's at best noise, but that doesn't mean we're all in the same place.
Hi, Peter. Kyle Pinn from Burns McDonnell. What would you say is the biggest impact to your models, your hypotheses based on who wins the next presidential election?
Oh, I mean, I can tell you exactly who's going to win. It's going to be Biden. It's going to be a landslide. And we've known this for over a year. So one of the things about January 6th is it happened just after an election. So its effects haven't been fully felt in terms of who votes for who. But when we got to the midterms, despite expecting a red wave, we had a red burp in the House and a red loss in the Senate. And what we found out is that the independents in the United States had changed considerably. Couple things. Number one, Trump has basically told independents that the general election doesn't matter, which means that the independents don't matter, and because the general election is the only place the independents have a voice. And so they reacted to that. In exit polling, something crazy like 85% of independents said that they despised the White House's economic policies and felt that they hurt independents more than anyone else. And independents are fickle. They almost always switch sides every election. They get buyer's remorse. And in the time before, they had voted for Biden. And now they were clearly fed up with him, but almost all of them voted for Democrats anyway. There's a saying in the State Department in the Middle East that we support one person, one vote, but not just one time. And if the independents were going to show up in numbers to vote against their own personal economic best interests in order to make sure they could vote again in an off year, you can bet they're going to do so in the general. Trump will probably carry no more than 12 states. And then the Republican Party is going to have to decide what to do with that. And the people who are, oh no, I broke it. The people who are here, the rhinos, are going to have to decide if they want to try to wait it out, which hasn't worked yet, or move on. And we'll know within 2 years.
All right, I think we're going to do one more question.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Steve Thornhill with Burns McDonnell. I guess you keep talking about China's going to collapse, Germany's going to collapse. What does that look like? Is that anarchy? Is that revolution?
Well, let's start with the Germans because that's probably simpler. Assuming for the moment that there's not a general European war, it will be a very organized decline because they're German. And we will see individual sectors that the Germans are no longer competitive fall off one after another. That's already happened in chemicals. It's already happened in processing. I'd say the next really big one will probably be automotive. Automotive requires customers. And in Europe, that was tapped out a long time ago. And in China, it's been tapped out now for 5 years. And if they relocate their supply chains to North America like the Japanese have, that means German workers aren't doing it anymore. So they're going to probably, things like transformers will probably be some of the last things that they do at scale. And they just fade away, unless there's a security crisis, in which case, God knows. China's collapsed over 20 times in its history. And every time it's gone down, they've lost at least a quarter of their population. Just playing the odds, because there's enough of a data set that you can do that with Chinese collapses, you get a civilizational break that kills over half the population because they're so dependent on energy and foodstuffs and food production inputs now. The North probably gets the worst of that. That's where about 2/3 of the population lives. And it'll probably fall into kind of a neo-Maoist tyranny. And remember that Xi has purged everyone who's capable. So there's no backup governments, even at the local level, waiting in the wings, which probably means warlords. Again, Chinese history suggests that. And then the southern cities from Shanghai to Hong Kong, they don't back up to a hinterland. They're kind of divorced from the rest of the Chinese system, always have been. And I would expect them to integrate with foreign powers in order to get food and energy. They'll trade their labor and their infrastructure to participate in someone else's supply chain. Historically speaking, that's usually how it's gone. These cities have gotten the majority of their calories from foreign partners for most of the last 1,600 years. The communist period is a real aberration in terms of actually being united with the Chinese whole. That's probably how it goes down. But again, this has happened over 20 times. There's a lot of potential paths. That's not the worst one.
Awesome. Let's give Peter a round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, well, that's it. I thought that was worth listening to and sharing, get our minds thinking. This is the statistics, this is business, you know, demographics. This is all the stuff they keep throwing at us, so we better understand it better. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'm off to do other things. Paul's off to do other things. Ulrich's going to do some other things. Carol, Jerry, who else was in here? Making sure Zen was in here, and you know, all those others that will come later. So I will see you guys next. I'll catch you later tonight, I'm sure. Well, bounce out.
This public service announcement is brought to you by Rotten Studios. Remember, no contact is the road to freedom.